Imagine for a second, right, that you were just sitting in a university lecture hall.
Okay.
You got your laptop open, taking notes, maybe trying to keep up with the professor's slides.
Yeah, typical Tuesday.
Right. Or, I mean, maybe you're just sitting on your couch, mindlessly scrolling through your social media feed, digesting, infographic after infographic.
Absolutely, we all do it.
Exactly. And in both of those scenarios, you probably believe you are simply absorbing facts, right? Just taking in information about history, sociology, or current events.
You assume you're learning.
Right. But what if you aren't just a passive consumer of knowledge? What if, in reality, you are the active target of a highly sophisticated psychological operation?
I mean, it is an incredibly unsettling concept.
It really is.
We all naturally want to believe that our minds are our own, private fortresses. We assume that the opinions we form, especially in academic environments, are the result of our own free will.
Right, our own independent logic.
Exactly. But when you start analyzing the actual mechanics of how information flows and, more importantly, how it is curated before it ever even reaches you, that comforting illusion of complete intellectual independence just kind of shatters.
Wow, yeah. So today, our mission is basically to hand you the blueprint to rebuild that fortress.
I love that.
We're doing a deep dive into how ideological manipulation influences students in academic settings, using this really fascinating book by Dr. Antonio Arnold.
Right, The Art of Deception, Understanding Propaganda and Its Impact on Society.
That's the one. And the ultimate goal of this deep dive is to serve as a guide for you, the listener, to reclaim your intellectual agency.
Because you really have to actively reclaim it.
Yeah. We are looking at Dr. Arnold's analysis alongside a frankly intense collection of visual propaganda symbols he uses to make his case.
The visual component is absolutely vital to understanding his argument. I mean, the source material places historical imagery like the Soviet hammer and sickle and the Nazi swastika directly alongside modern political and cultural iconography.
Right, which is quite the comparison.
It is. We are talking about the Antifa flag, Black Lives Matter logos, the Free Palestine flag, Democratic Party donkey.
Even those ubiquitous social media misinformation warnings, right?
Exactly. The author is demanding that we look at these not just as symbols, but as functional tools of psychological leverage.
Which is wild to think about. I am incredibly curious to dissect how he draws a line from literal historical war zones to, like, a modern-day sociology seminar.
It's a very direct line, actually.
Well, because before we can really understand the mechanics of how we are being manipulated, we have to understand the specific lens of the person revealing these tactics, right?
Yeah, the source matters.
Right. Dr. Antonio Arnold isn't just some academic theorizing from an ivory tower. He's a very specific military background that grounds this entire book.
He does. Dr. Arnold actually served as a civil affairs specialist within the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command. Yeah, that is an airborne unit under the U.S. Army Special Operations Command. His job was literally the application of psyops.
Okay, wait, let me stop you there, because when most people hear the word psyops, they picture, I don't know, cartoonish mind control.
Right, the tinfoil hat stuff.
Exactly. Or like dropping propaganda leaflets out of a bomber. But a civil affairs specialist operating on the ground in a conflict zone is doing something much more intricate, right?
Right.
What does that actually look like in practice?
It is deeply analytical and highly subtle. On the ground, a civil affairs specialist isn't dealing in overt brainwashing. They are dealing in the architecture of perception.
The architecture of perception.
Right. Their role involves analyzing a target population, identifying their cultural friction points, mapping out their deep-seated insecurity,
Okay.
and then strategically injecting narratives or resources that fracture enemy cohesion. You figure out what a population fears, what they revere, and who they trust.
That's intense.
And then you methodically manipulate those elements to shift their behavior without ever firing a single bullet. And Dr. Arnold also served in the Air Guard, where he noted this profound disconnect between the neatly packaged media narratives broadcast back home and the messy reality on the ground.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that fundamentally changes how I view the rest of this text.
How so?
Well, it's like realizing that the subtle marketing tricks used to sell you a lifestyle are actually derived from the exact same military playbooks used to demoralize an enemy, right?
That is spot on. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the central thesis here is that the battlefield has just shifted.
Right.
The tactics engineered to win hearts and minds or to fracture alliances in a war zone didn't just stay quarantined in the military domain.
They bled over.
They adapted. They transitioned seamlessly into civilian life, targeting the daily flow of information to everyday citizens. The territory being conquered is no longer physical land, it is cognitive space.
And cognitive space is never more vulnerable than when it belongs to a young person.
Absolutely.
The book argues that if you want to understand the architecture of modern academic manipulation, you have to look back at the 20th century.
You really do.
You have to look at how these psyop tactics were essentially beta tested on youth populations. Dr. Arnold dedicates a lot of ink to historical totalitarian regimes, specifically the Nazis and the Bolsheviks.
He focuses on those regimes because they pretty much perfected the art of weaponizing the classroom.
Right.
But the text isn't just giving us a basic history lesson on the atrocities of these governments. It focuses on the subtle, structural ways they rewired the social incentive systems for students.
Yeah, how they actually did it.
Exactly. When the Nazi regime rose to power, they didn't just ban certain books. They fundamentally altered the mechanisms of educational content to promote Aryan supremacy and dehumanize perceived enemies.
They were basically turning the school system into an assembly line for ideological compliance.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, if you control what a child believes is historically objective, you own the future of the nation.
And the Bolshevik Revolution operated on identical psychological principles, just, utilizing a different ideological framework.
Right, a different flavor of the same thing.
Yeah, the communists completely reshaped the Russian curriculum to incite rebellion against the Tsar and legitimize a new socialist order. And Dr. Arnold stresses that these were not organic cultural shifts.
They were engineered.
Totally calculated, deliberate psychological operations designed to entirely replace independent critical thought with unquestioning allegiance to the state narrative.
Okay, I hear that, but I keep bumping up against a major discrepancy here.
What's that?
Well, a regime in the 1930s had absolute power, right? If you question the Bolshevik curriculum, you face the secret police or the gulag.
Right, the threat was very physical.
Exactly. The threat was physical violence. But if a student is sitting in a modern university setting today, there is no secret police. So how does a massive institution translate that level of compliance to a modern democratic society without students immediately noticing and just calling it out?
That is the pivotal question the author addresses. The critical insight is that the underlying psychological levers of manipulation remain identical, but the delivery system evolves.
Ah, okay.
Modern manipulation in a free society cannot rely on the blatant, forced indoctrination of a dictatorship. It just wouldn't work.
People would rebel.
Exactly. So it relies on monopolizing the narrative so completely that dissent doesn't feel illegal. It feels socially fatal.
Socially fatal. Wow. So instead of a soldier at the front of the classroom demanding loyalty with a weapon, the threat is social ostracization.
Bingo.
It is the fear of being isolated by your peers or perhaps failing the course if you dare to question the foundational premise of what the professor is teaching.
That is exactly the point the book makes. The goal of a modern academic psyop isn't to force you to recite a pledge. The goal is to make you self-censor.
That's terrifying.
It is. It is to architect an environment where certain questions are simply understood to be completely off limits. And to understand the mechanics of how that subtle control is achieved, Dr. Arnold breaks down manipulation into 5 distinct stages.
Yes, okay, let's map out these 5 stages of manipulation. Because here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
When I was reading this section, the macro-level institutional tactics sounded eerily identical to the cycle of abuse in a toxic romantic relationship.
It is wild how well the psychology of control scales up. I mean, it goes from an interpersonal dynamic between 2 people to a massive societal campaign targeting millions. Let's walk through the framework.
Okay, so stage 1 is the appeal phase. In a toxic relationship, this is basically the love bombing phase.
Right.
The manipulator showers the target with praise, studies their deep-seated insecurities, and says exactly what they want to hear to create a sense of emotional dependency.
Exactly. And the author argues that in an academic or political setting, this is the institution appealing to a student's innate desire to be good, right? To be on the right side of history, or to feel intellectually enlightened.
And the neurological mechanism here is crucial, isn't it?
It is. When a student's values are validated by an authority figure or an institution, it triggers a massive dopamine release. It builds rapid, totally unearned trust.
Wow. So they let their guard down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The target drops their critical defenses because they feel deeply understood and morally validated. The institution identifies what the student cares about most: perhaps, justice, equality, or compassion, and presents itself as the sole guardian of those virtues.
Which perfectly sets the trap for stage 2, the bully phase.
Right.
In a relationship, this is when the mask slips.
Right.
They start testing your boundaries, applying covert pressure.
Yeah, testing the waters.
And on a campus, according to the text, this is when the narrative begins to demand compliance. The student is told that to truly support those virtues of justice or equality, they must adopt a highly specific, rigidly defined academic framework.
And if they don't, they're suddenly viewed with suspicion.
Right. And if the student attempts to maintain their independence or questions that framework, the pressure escalates to stage 3, the guilt trip phase.
Yeah. This is where the gaslighting really comes in. The manipulator twists the narrative and shifts the blame.
By design.
Right, entirely by design.
Yeah.
If a student questions a biased curriculum, the institution or the prevailing campus culture tells the student that the mere act of questioning is evidence of their own ignorance.
Or their privilege, or some deep moral failing.
Exactly. The goal is to induce severe cognitive dissonance. You make the target question their own sanity and judgment.
Which is so messed up.
It is. If they feel guilty enough, they will abandon their critical thinking just to regain that moral high ground the institution promised them back in stage 1.
But I'm stuck on how this bypasses the faculty. I mean, if a university is utilizing these stages, wouldn't tenure track professors, people whose entire professional existence is supposedly built on fostering debate, wouldn't they be the first to sound the alarm?
You would think so, right? But Dr. Arnold's framework suggests that professors are often caught in the exact same psychological cycle.
Really?
Yeah. The institution creates an environment where questioning the prevailing orthodoxy is a career ender. Faculty are subject to the same social and professional pressures as the students.
That makes sense.
And if the guilt trip fails to bring someone back into line, we move to stage 4, the plead phase.
Oh, this is pure empathy hacking.
It really is. This is where the manipulator relies on emotional appeals, like, look at the harm you are causing by refusing to adopt our language or our framework.
Do it for the greater good.
Exactly. Think of the marginalized communities you are hurting by asking these questions. It bypasses logic entirely and just targets the student's compassion.
And finally, if the student still holds their ground, they hit stage 5, the outrage phase.
Right. Full-blown destabilization.
In a one-on-one dynamic, this is where the toxic partner lashes out with unhinged anger.
Yeah.
But in the societal or academic version, this is basically cancellation.
Yeah, the shouting down of guest speakers, the absolute refusal to engage in debate, replaced by pure, intimidating, performative outrage.
And there's a reason it works so well.
There is an evolutionary psychology component to this that makes it incredibly effective. To a social primate, being entirely exiled from the tribe historically meant death.
Wow. Yeah.
When a student faces the outrage phase, the threat of being publicly shamed and expelled from their social group, their brain literally processes it as an existential threat. The fear of social death forces compliance where logic never could.
Man, when you lay out the neurology of it, you realize that a student's intense emotional reaction to like a viral social media post or a highly charged lecture is rarely an accident.
No, it is engineered.
You feel outraged or deeply guilty or incredibly validated because those specific psychological levers are being pulled on schedule.
Which is exactly why the author takes this historical blueprint and these 5 psychological stages and applies them directly to today's highly polarized cultural battlegrounds.
Right.
He argues that modern universities frequently function as platforms for this exact type of ideological manipulation, utilizing biased curricula, heavily curated guest speaker lists, and the aggressive suppression of dissenting thought.
And the text and the visual sources get incredibly specific about the modern applications here.
They really do.
And look, to be clear, we need to state this explicitly for everyone listening. Our role here is to impartially report the analysis presented in Dr. Arnold's book.
Exactly.
And to describe the visual evidence he provides. We're examining his argument about how these symbols function totally regardless of our own political leanings.
Right, we are just looking at the mechanics. The book notes that critics frequently accuse modern political entities, specifically highlighting the Democratic Party, of employing psyops, intimidation tactics, and strategic messaging.
Okay.
The author cites arguments that these methods are systematically used to heavily influence minority groups, such as Black American communities, and liberal voters in an effort to consolidate political power.
And the sources explicitly link modern institutional frameworks and cultural movements to the historical methods of psychological manipulation we just discussed, right?
Yes, very explicitly.
The text calls out diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, DEI, as well as the imagery associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, the Free Palestine flag, and Antifa imagery.
And the visual sources we are reviewing are quite provocative in how they frame this.
Very much so.
We are looking at a collection of images where modern mainstream media logos, social media influencer icons, and the Democratic donkey are explicitly paired alongside historical flags of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany.
So the visual argument being made here is that there is a direct, unbroken continuum of propaganda.
Precisely.
The technological tools have evolved from, 1930s radio broadcasts to highly sophisticated TikTok algorithms and mandatory university DEI seminars. But the ultimate goal, ideological control and behavioral compliance, remains identical.
Right. The author posits that just as the Bolsheviks used the hammer and sickle to rally a specific emotional response, enforce an ideology, and identify who was compliant and who was a dissident,
Modern movements use their respective symbols to do the exact same thing within the halls of academia.
exactly. They function as behavioral compliance tests.
So what does this all mean? Like, how does that actually work mechanically?
What do you mean?
I keep putting myself in the shoes of a 19-year-old student walking across the quad. If they're surrounded by these highly charged symbols, an Antifa flag in a dorm window, a Black Lives Matter logo embedded in a sociology syllabus, a Free Palestine protest blocking the student union, how does the mere presence of those symbols act as a mechanism of compliance?
Well, according to the book's framework, these symbols and their associated curricula often establish a strict binary.
Okay.
Take a heavily politicized DEI framework, for example. The critique is that it rarely presents itself as one of many sociological theories to be debated. Instead, it presents itself as absolute moral truth.
Ah, I see.
You are either an active ally or you are complicit in oppression. There is no neutral ground allowed.
So by removing the middle ground, the institution basically forces the student into the bullying guilt phases.
Exactly. The syllabus inherently demands compliance because questioning the material is framed as an act of moral violence.
Yeah. This raises an important question, right? Something mentioned in the outline for this deep dive, the ethics of influence.
Right.
Because all education is, by definition, an attempt to influence a student's mind. So where is the line drawn between genuine, objective education and a coordinated ideological psyop?
The line is drawn at institutional accountability and the tolerance for dissent.
Okay, unpack that.
Genuine education teaches a student how to think. It presents a framework, invites aggressive scrutiny, and allows the student to poke holes in the theory without penalty.
Right, that's what we expect from a university.
But a psyop, masquerading as education, trains a student what to think. It presents a politicized framework as unquestionable dogma.
And if they challenge it?
If the student challenges it, they are subjected to the outrage phase, penalized with a failing grade, social ostracization, or disciplinary action.
Right.
When the penalty for questioning the material is social or academic ruin, you are no longer in an educational environment.
You are in an indoctrination environment.
Exactly.
You are caught in the trap. And knowing how the trap is built is the first step to dismantling it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Dr. Arnold doesn't just outline the architecture of this manipulation. He frames his conclusion as a tactical guide for resistance. He really wants to hand the listener the tools to reclaim their agency.
He does. And there is a powerful visual source included in the stack that illustrates this perfectly. It is an image with the words "resist manipulation" in bold typography, showing a pair of hands physically cutting the strings of a puppet master looming above.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it represents the conscious severing of emotional dependency on these institutions.
So what are the actual tools to cut those strings? If a student is sitting in that lecture hall right now listening to this, what is their defense mechanism?
The primary tool is the aggressive application of critical thinking. And that doesn't just mean developing a cynical attitude toward everything you hear.
Right.
It means actively choosing to cross-reference information from multiple opposing viewpoints. If a professor, a textbook, or a social media feed hands you a perfectly packaged, emotionally charged narrative that makes you feel a sudden surge of righteous anger or deep, paralyzing guilt.
That emotional spike is your cue to pause.
Exactly. You have to recognize that your emotional reaction is the intended product of stage 3 or stage 5.
Yeah.
You have to consciously step outside of the emotional manipulation.
There's another image in our sources that drives this home, right?
Yes, it's a stark silhouette of a speaker at a podium, looming over a faceless, compliant crowd, and underneath it is a single word: Fear.
Fear is the engine of the entire operation.
It really is. You cannot let the fear of social isolation or the fear of a bad grade prevent you from demanding evidence. You must foster and demand environments of open debate.
That's easier said than done, though.
Oh, it's incredibly difficult. But if you find yourself in a classroom where questioning the core premise of a lesson is implicitly or explicitly banned, you have to recognize the reality of your situation. You must ask the hard questions. You must ask the professor for the opposing evidence.
Because recognizing the playbook is the ultimate armor.
Precisely.
Once you understand the military origins, and you can clearly identify the appeal, the bully, the guilt trip, the plead, and the outrage happening in real time, the manipulator just loses their power.
They do. Once you see the puppet strings, they have a much harder time making you dance.
It requires relentless vigilance, doesn't it?
It really does. You have to start treating your own attention, your intellectual curiosity, and your emotional responses as highly valuable contested territory that unseen forces are actively trying to conquer.
It really is a cognitive battlefield.
Hmm.
And unpacking all of this leaves me with a lingering thought. It's something that isn't explicitly answered in the text, but it builds off everything we've just discussed today. Well, if every institution, every curriculum, and every human professor has some inherent bias or underlying ideological agenda, is it truly objective education even possible anymore?
That is the defining challenge of modern academia. I mean, if absolute neutrality is a myth, how do we navigate the system?
Maybe the ultimate test of your intelligence isn't finding a perfectly unbiased source of information.
Right.
Maybe the real test is simply recognizing the underlying mechanics of the propaganda you are consuming and deciding for yourself which influences you are willing to tolerate.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
Because if you are sitting in that lecture hall with your laptop open taking notes, the most important life-altering thing you can learn might not be the facts presented on the professor's slides.
No, it might not be.
It might be the sudden realization that the lecture itself is a psychological operation, and deciding right then and there that your mind belongs to you.